G'day guys, we're going to be painting a cube right now. So based on the theory that we covered in our first video, we're going to be diving into painting our cube. So the way that I like to do everything is I like to make a list of all the things that I need to do. So that way I don't have to keep too many ideas in my head. I don't have to remember too many things. So if we remember back to the theory that we covered, the first thing that we want to establish is our light direction. So we know that we want our light to be a quarter angle light. So in this case, we just have to choose, does the light coming from the left or does the light coming from the right? So I'm going to say, just to make my life a little easier, my light source is going to come in from the right hand side, moving towards the left. All right, makes my life pretty simple. The next thing I need to do is I need to establish my 1, 2, and 3 faces. After that, I need to work out my values. That is the values for my 1, 2, and 3. Once I've done that, I then want to deal with, effectively, I want to block in my values. After that, I want to look at gradients. Right, so that's our bounce light. And of course, I also want to think about my shadows, because every object is going to have a shadow. And finally, I might add in some highlights just to make the image pop a little bit more. So what I've got here is a nice checklist of all the things that I need to do. Now this is my preference of working. Obviously you don't have to do the same thing, but my preference is to create these checklists so that I know what I need to do. Again, it just takes that stress off from doing these things, especially when you're learning. When you're learning, you have all these things in your head, these new ideas, these new techniques, and it can get a little bit overwhelming. So by having this checklist here, it just means that, okay, we just have to focus on one thing at one time. And that way we're not going to get too overwhelmed. So let's start off. I know my light is coming in. I'll create a new layer first. And we can say this is our notes. So I know that my light is coming in, right, at this angle. And let's say I'm going to have it come in relatively steep. That means that the light is going to hit this first, so that's going to be my number 1. Therefore, this is number 2, and therefore this is number 3. I can actually jump ahead a little bit and decide my shadows. There's going to be a separate video talking about how to plot shadows, but for now we're going to really just quickly estimate what our shadows are. Since my light is moving in this direction, I know that whatever shadow gets projected is going to get projected in this direction as well. And probably something back here, that's probably where that corner is. My light angle is coming down like this. That means that I'm going to get a pretty steep shadow coming down. And that's going to result in a shadow that's going to look something like this. So there we go. Very quickly, I've established my shadow. The reason why I want it nice and short as well is I don't want this image to trail off with this really big shadow tail, right? I just want it nice, short, and compact. Of course, when you're practicing as well, it's up to you how you want to do this. So I have established my light direction, done. I've established my 1, 2, 3, done. Now I need to work out my values for my 1, 2, 3. So, very easy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go with the very stock standard. 40% is going to be my brightest value. That means if I go down to 100%, halfway is going to be 70, and that's going to be my number 3. And 55 is going to be my number 2. Now, this is where using Photoshop is really, really handy. I can create a new layer, go in and use my marquee tool or my lasso tool, and I can literally select out the parts that I want, right? Like so. I can choose my value. In this case, it's 55. I'm just going to use 50 for the sake of just, it's a little easier. And voila, here we go. I've bucket filled it straight away. And I'm going to name this my number 2 face. Create another layer, and I'm going to repeat the same thing. Let's go for our number 1 this time. I'm following the guide of my line drawing underneath. I just realized that hasn't quite gone where I want it to go. There we go. There's my 40. I can drop it in. And let's call this my number 1 face. Right, nice and easy. Now, you'll see that there's a few gaps here and there. Don't worry about those. We can always fix them up later. Again, that's one of the really nice things about working on the digital platform. Let's call this our number 3 face. Select our assembly. We can bucket fill that in. So already, if I turn off that back drawing here, you can see that just with these flat base values, we have a pretty good approximation of what that shape is. Now, if we want to jump ahead again and be a little, push our abilities a little bit more, we can also handle the shadow. Now, your shadow typically is going to be a midtone. It's going to be the same value as your number 2, plus or minus a little bit, depending on the ground that your object is sitting on. So let's say if we're sitting on a much darker value, in this case, this is white, just like our object is white. So in which case, that's why our value is going to be the same as our number 2, our midtone. But let's say if this object was sitting on a darker value, let's say the ground plane was a 20-30% value. What we would do then is we would add that value onto the midtone value to create our shadow, because the shadow is being projected on to that particular object or that particular ground plane. So let's go ahead and label these. Now, if you're wondering how you could possibly do this on paper using traditional media, you can. It's actually quite simple. When we're working with traditional media, you see how with this I've broken down 10% increments. Now, if you're working with markers, Copic markers, for example, their cool grays or warm grays will be a letter plus a number, right? And what this number represents is it's a percentage value. So a C1, for example, sorry, they do them in single digits, not 2. So a C1 means a cool gray at 10%. A C5 would be a cool gray at 50%. Right? Or a W8 would be a warm gray at 80% towards being black. So if you're using markers, you can still use this process. If you're using pencil, same thing. H1, H2, B1, B2, etc. We can still create this gradient. So just because, if you're deciding to do this on paper and you're using traditional mediums, this same theory applies, right? The only thing with digital is that it's just you have a little bit more control over it and you can fiddle around with things a little bit more. So I've gone ahead and I've established my values over here and I've actually blocked them in. So the next step I need to do is I need to put in my gradients. So luckily I have my pre-made faces all done. So I'm going to turn off the rest because I don't want them to get in the way. And I'm going to turn on my number 2 face. I'll do that first. I just have to select it and I can hold Control and then click on this in my layer file, and it's going to select everything that's already there, and that way I don't have to worry about painting past it. So as an example, you see how it doesn't go past these marching ants. And these marching ants can be a little bit distracting, so you can also hit Command H and that's going to hide them, but they're still there. On paper, this gets a little bit trickier. You have to use tape, you have to section things off, and that becomes a little bit more troublesome. But again, traditionally, that's how we would have done it in the past. So now that we have this, I'm going to go ahead and select a round circle brush. Everything we use in this demo series is going to be the most basic default tools available. When you're learning and when you're still a student, you don't want to play with texture brushes. You don't want to play with special effects brushes. You want to use the most basic default tools available. Because if you're playing around with texture brushes, if you're playing around with the VFX stuff, then you're finding ways to cut corners, right, without realizing. You want to do everything as a student the hard way, because that's how you're going to learn. So as we talked about last time, there's going to be a gradient, and so it's going to be brightest at the bottom, darkest at the top. Now you have two choices. Whatever you choose, it's fine, but it has to be consistent. So in this case, I'm going to say that I want it to be brighter at the bottom, right, than the core value. So I'm just going to slowly bring up the value. And what I'm going to do is I'm also going to drop my opacity and my flow down so that it's not as severe. Right, and I'm going to bring it up evenly. I'm going to leave this value the way that, you know, the original value as it is. So when it comes time to paint my number 3 and number 1, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to add in a lighter value to get that gradient. If in this case we added in a darker value to get that gradient, we'd want to be consistent and do the same thing to those other faces as well. And all I'm doing now is just picking a color. Let's say I'm picking back to this color, and I'm just slowly blending them back in. And I'm holding Alt to get the eyedropper out. Now, the other thing to be very careful about is when you're drawing, sorry, let me rephrase. When you're sort of blending this gradient in, make sure to blend it following back to your vanishing points, because we want to make sure that this surface reads as if it is a vertical surface. It's not on an angle. So you see how as I pull it, I'm not pulling it in weird directions. I'm making sure that I'm pulling back to some vanishing point far off in the distance over here. It's very important that this gradient runs perpendicular, or sorry, I guess parallel to your to lines that would emanate out from your vanishing point. Right, very simple. All I'm using is just a hard round brush. And you'll notice that when I start my paintbrush or my stroke, I don't start here and then end over here. I start past and I finish past as well. And this ensures that I get a nice sort of smooth thickness across the entire surface. With pen pressure, right, whether you're doing it on digital platform or you're doing it by hand, right, using traditional media, I'm going to increase this and show you what happens with pen pressure if we don't do that. So I'm going to pick this so it's really obvious. If I start here and I end there, you see how we get this weird sort of bowing effect, right? And this will happen with markers, this will happen with pencil, so we want to avoid that. But if we start out here and we follow through, we get a much more consistent thickness to our stroke. So I'm just going to roll back. And so this becomes our first gradient. Let's jump to our number 3 face. Actually, this time, we're going to do the same thing. Now, you'll find that when you draw things or when you paint, there's going to be a particular movement that is going to feel a little bit more natural to you. My natural movement is to move from left to right. So it's going to be a little bit hard for me to pull right to left. So on paper, I would spin my page around. On the computer, I can simply rotate my canvas. And again, to be consistent, let's drop this back to what we had it before. We're going to add in a lighter value. And all we're going to do at this point is just to start to blend it in. Now, when we talked about the theory behind this, and we had a look at some of our reference images as well, the number 3 face does things a little bit differently. But right now, we're just trying to get a basic understanding. We're trying to hammer home the core principles of bounce light and gradients, where it's brightest at the bottom, darkest at the top. So we'd want to, let's say, selectively omit certain things in the beginning. We don't want to overcomplicate the process. It's very important that we understand, well, let me hide my marching ants first. It's very important that we understand that learning is an iterative process. We have to go through and repeat things and slowly build up our understanding. We can't just jump to the end straight away. If we jump to the end straight away, we might, by chance, get a really cool result. But the problem is we may not be able to repeat that result, or we may not understand how we got that result in the first place. And that can be very, very detrimental, right? Because it's not just important, how do I phrase this? It's not just about getting a good execution, right? It's great to be able to have a really nice execution, like a really beautiful finished product. What's equally important, though, is that we understand how we got there so that we can repeat it. We don't want a situation to arise where we are guessing as to how we got that result. So I'm onto my number one surface here. I'm going to select my value. And again, we're introducing a line of value. In this case, because there's nothing around it to give a bounce light, it's going to move in the direction of the light. Now, the top surface the gradient is always going to be quite subtle, much more subtle than our ground plane. Just because it is probably going to be quite far away from the light source, right? So it's not going to be as close to any reflective light source, and so it's going to be a little bit more subtle. And you'll see when I'm pulling this, I'm making sure that because my light is running in this direction, it's running horizontally across, I'm going to try and pull my gradients for my top surface to be perpendicular, that is at 90 degrees with my light direction. And so here's my cube. Now again, we're going to come back and fix these little inconsistencies, like these little edges that might poke out and so on later. But let's go to the shadow here. And I'm going to turn off some of these nodes so that we get a bit more of an unobstructed view. Here's my shadow. I'm going to select it again and hide my marching ants. Now, shadows start to lose their intensity as they move away from the object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a light, just like the others. I'm going to introduce a lighter value around my shadow. And then just to enhance things a little bit, actually we'll keep it like this for now. We're just going to work with this gradient. It's a little trickier to work with a shadow because we're not just moving in one way. We've got this sort of L section over here that we have to deal with. So it's a little bit harder, a little bit trickier. Oh, picked up the wrong value over there. Now, as the shadow moves away from the object, it starts to lose its intensity. That means that over here, we're going to get a little bit of a bleed coming in from that external element as well. So we want to introduce that in here. And just add a little bit more of a lighter value in here. Now, you might notice that this result is a little bit clinical. It's a little bit dry. It doesn't have a lot of sort of artistic flair in it. And that is the purpose of what we're doing. So what we're trying to achieve with these is we're trying to get a pretty solid understanding of how to apply that theory that we spoke about. Now, when you are painting, try to use a large brush. You want to avoid using small brushes where possible. And then what we can do is we can take a much larger brush, because when you use a small brush, you get these little brush strokes. And if you don't like the look of them, we can take a larger brush and we can drop our opacity and our flow really low. And we can kind of just blanket them with sort of that value, just to try and homogenize some things. The other thing that we can do is we can take a more painterly approach, and that is we can constantly merge these values together. So we're actually using our brush strokes to create a little bit of chaos. We can apply the same idea to these faces, so why don't we go ahead and do that over here as well. So I can take my brush, it's a little bit smaller than what it was, and I can go in and kind of just dab certain areas. Just to break some of that smoothness that comes through it. And I'll give it a little bit more of an organic sort of look, a more painterly look as well. But again, that's not really our objective. Our goal is to try and understand how to apply that theory there. Now, let's actually go in and clean up our little gaps and things over here. So obviously, if we zoom in, we can see that, you know, little elements are, you know, breaking through and so on. A couple of ways we can change this. The easiest one is simply we just create a layer underneath our number 2 value. And because our number 1 is on a separate layer, we can simply go and select the value that we want, bring up our opacity and our flow, and just fill it. And we'll also notice that our number 1 over here has extended a little bit too far. So I can use my lasso tool, select it, the part that I don't want, and I can go ahead and erase that. Now, it's a little trickier when you're dealing with, when you're working on paper, but in that case, what we used to do is we would take a scalpel and then we'd cleanly cut things off and then photocopy it. But that's really going very, very old school. This part's poking out a little bit more. Again, I just have to select that, push it back a little with my marquee tool, get rid of this, and it gets us a nice cleaner shape. So we've now gone through and we've added our bounce light. We've actually gone in and done our shadows as well. And finally, we can look at highlights. If you think back, I described light as something very similar to water. So with that in mind, if you imagine light coming down and hitting this object, right, it's coming down at an angle, it's hitting this object. Like water, it's going to want to bead around the edges and flow down in certain sections. So we can use that to our advantage to highlight certain elements, to really pop some of these edges. Remember, our goal is to make sure there's clarity between these 3 faces. So this is where we get a much smaller brush. Again, we want to drop down our flow and our opacity just so that we get something a little bit softer. And I can choose, let's say, a brighter value than what we have here, because it's going to be a little bit of a highlight. And I can kind of just drop it down very lightly along the edge. At the apex over here, it can be a little bit brighter. We can apply the same idea. It's going to be brighter than this along these edges here. Rotate my canvas. Again, this one might start off being a little bit closer to our mid-range value. Now I'm using the shift click function, By hand, you could use a ruler. We got a nice sort of edge highlight along these. Now we may want to just kind of soften that a little bit by dropping down the opacity. When you're working on paper, it's a little easier because what you're using is most likely a color pencil, like a white pencil, and you can ease off the pressure that you apply. Now, if we have highlights, we can also, I guess, have the dark equivalent of a highlight, in which case it would be something known as an occlusion shadow. And an occlusion shadow is a shadow that's created by an object when it makes contact with the ground. And that would be something down here. And we can use that to help separate out our form from the actual shadow. Occlusion shadow is quite dark. So in this case, I'm using my number 3 and then just darkening a little bit, finding the edge over here. And it's really just to draw along this bottom, just to give it a bit more of a kick. And I do want to zoom in. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to erase out something like this. And it's just to show a little offset, because the way that you get an occlusion shadow is like so. Where are my notes? The way that occlusion shadow works is if you have an object, let's say a box sitting on the ground, if that section there is at 90 degrees, you're not going to get an occlusion shadow because it's going to be flush to the ground plane. To get an occlusion shadow, what it means is that your object has a slight lip, also has a slight radius or a chamfer at the bottom to the ground where it can cast a little bit of a shadow there. And because of that lip, whether it's a radius or a chamfer, that's what's going to create this little indent over here, right? Because the actual contact point is a little bit smaller than the overall shape. All right, so here we have our cube pretty much done, right? Following the basic formula. And again, like I said, we've got this checklist and we're really just following this checklist through. What I'm going to do now though is I'm going to take this and I'm going to merge it together. And I'm going to show you the really cool thing about using this is that we are then able to select certain parts. I'm going to select this. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to adjust the brightness. So let me hide my marching ants first. And I'm going to show you guys, because we established this particular relationship between our 1, 2, and 3 values, as I change, I'm going to leave my contrast alone, but as I change the brightness and the darkness of the values, you notice how it's still very clear as to what the 1, 2, 3 values are. And it's because we've established this relationship between our 1, 2, and 3 values, so that as we change certain elements, it still reads correctly. And this is a really cool thing about using this process. So let's say I change it like this. What I can do now is just to make it as if it's a separate part, like a toy. Use something quite dark. And I'm going to go ahead and create, just going to make my brush a little bit larger. Create a little bit of an occlusion shadow for where this part, might click on to this, to the base. Now that's quite dark, it's a black line, and that's going to create a lip. And so if it creates a lip, it's going to create a highlight as well. And that highlight value is going to change depending on the surface that it's sitting on. That kind of ate into my shadow a little bit. And so now we can see how, even though this has become a separate part, all right, using separate values, that relationship that we've established allows us to still maintain sort of a unity between everything over here. All right, so that's the end of this particular part, this demo on cubes. The next one we're going to do is how we might go about calculating a chamfered surface or an incline onto a particular object.